Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 21st of November 2023. Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on, and welcome to some new names. Richard just said, I'm first-time viewer. Welcome. Great to see you on there, and nice to see so many other new names as well as some of the old faithfuls. And it's a really important conversation here tonight. Leith, of course, will be in just a moment. He's reconnected. Phew. But before I bring him in, let me just remind you, as I always do, that we're not providing specific financial or legal or property advice. It's the general conversation only. The chat room is moderated, but feel free to throw your comments and thoughts in. I won't necessarily be able to follow all the conversations because the chat room is very busy, but we do moderate the stream. This is as at 21st of November 23 if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to ask a question or to get my attention, if you use @WalkTheWorld, then that puts it at the top of my queue and it gives me a chance to make sure that I see it. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get your question to the top of the queue, you can do that via Super Chat, or indeed use Super Chat to make a contribution to what we do here more generally. Always greatly appreciated. We do this not for profit, but because we think there's a really important conversation to be had. And your Super Chat contributions are always greatly appreciated. Anyway, without further ado, let me push this button and bring Leith in. Hi, Leith.
G'day, Martin. G'day, everyone. Sorry about the internet problems. Had an NBN technician out yesterday to check out my connections. It's been stuffing up for a couple of weeks now, actually, and it's messed up on me a few times going live on, just about to go live onto Sky News, etc. So anyway, it's running well today, and then as usual, Murphy's Law strikes about 10 minutes before I'm about to go live. So I'm actually running off Wi-Fi. I did have a 30-meter Ethernet cable plugged in, but for some reason my computer's rejecting it. So I'm running off a Wi-Fi extender. So we'll just have to see how it goes. Hopefully it holds up. It seems to be pretty good so far.
Well, it's holding up so far, but I'll tell you what, rebooting the computer 2 minutes before you go live is, I call that a ballsy move, but well done.
Yeah, I sort of had to. I literally, it was a stage where I had a connection with Martin, but I couldn't open up any other web page or anything. It just kept saying not connected, and then it had a warning saying in the side saying you're connected to the internet, but your connection's poor. So anyway, I just ripped the Band-Aid off, and here we are. So let's hope it's nice and clean.
Well, that's interesting. Of course, I'm in the UK at the moment. I'm paying 1/10 of what I was paying in Australia for a 1 gigabit down connection, 1/10. And so far, it's not dropped once all the months I've been here, right? Whereas the NBN, even with my premium service, it was always pretty wobbly. I have to say, I think Australia's been badly done by the connectivity. It's just disgraceful.
Yeah, mate, I'm on a 50/20 now, so 50 down, 20 up, and I reckon I rarely get that, but and I'm paying $95 a month. So I'm about to actually switch to Aussie broadband because I'm fed up with Telstra. Really, you're just shuffling deck chairs in the Titanic. Let's face it. You're still using the NBN, still the same hardware, it's the same network. So it's it's a bit like Australia's energy market. You can bring in a state regulator like the SEC in Victoria, but if you don't fix all the upstream problems, you're still going to be getting ripped off. Yeah, and that's basically where
the overall strategy was messed over when they actually decided to go hybrid rather than actually full fibre. I mean, I've got full fibre here, but interestingly in the UK they went the same route, and so they've got this sort of two-speed internet. So if you're in an area where you don't have fibre, then you've got all sorts of issues just like in the in Australia. But if you've got fibre direct, then it's a completely different ballgame. So it just shows you that the underlying topology and technology you choose makes a huge difference. But there you go. It's amazing.
Happy days.
Yeah, indeed. And Jason, just so you know, Jason just asked a question. I've got expensive. Yeah, it was expensive in Australia, but I'm paying £40 a month. £40, so that's $80 a month for 1 gigabit up, 1 gigabit down. Unlimited.
Yeah, well, especially in your line of work, you need that, don't you? I mean, most of the time I spend just writing, and it's web pages, that sort of thing. But when I do this sort of thing or Sky News,
It's crazy. It's a critical service. In my view, it's in the same category as electricity and water and those sorts of things. Particularly for what I do here, of course. Anyway, let's move off the. We could spend all evening talking about the stupidity of NBN and all the silly decisions that were taken. But we've got a bigger conversation, Leith. Australia is going to hell in a handbasket, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's been reflected in the polls actually. So as we all know, we had the pandemic, had the massive stimulus, and there was a couple of years of, I guess, good times economically. We had a whole bunch of people left the country. We had a huge stimulus. We had a big jump of household disposable income. It was happy days for a few years, low inflation, low interest rates, blah blah blah, and all that's pretty much as we know reversed now. We've got basically record numbers of people coming in, an intractable housing crisis. Governments are basically, trying to cut back on infrastructure at the same time as they're running record immigration. We've got record plunging household disposable income. Australia's got, according to some measures, the highest embedded or entrenched inflation in the world. The last couple of weeks have seen the Albanese government break 3 world records for disposable income. Household disposable income falls, the worst rental market, and also the highest entrenched inflation. Not exactly records you want to have in a per capita recession, and it's all kind of getting reflected. It's all getting reflected in the latest opinion polls for the government, which basically shows that it's now trailing the coalition.
One term basis. One term, probably.
One term, mate. Half of one term, pretty much. Right. So we've basically seen a record collapse in living standards in 18 months, and then we've also seen probably a record collapse in government support in 18 months. I'm not saying they're going to necessarily lose the next election because it's pretty, the coalition's doing everything they can to lose with Peter Dutton, but it's extraordinary. And the worst thing is the federal government's not been honest about the situation. It keeps gaslighting us on saying that it's delivering record wage growth when real wages have tanked to 2010 levels. It's delivering record jobs growth. Well, who cares? Because the jobs growth isn't keeping up with the number of migrants you're bringing in. It's fixing housing supply with its, wet lettuce Housing Australia Future Fund when the rental crisis is worse than ever. We've got people being made homeless and people have been forced into share housing and rental stress and everything. So it's just basically, lying about everything and then hoping that we won't notice. But of course, people are noticing, and because they live in it, and you can't deny. People notice when it's hitting them in the hip pocket, and they're going, "Well, I'm way worse off now than I was 3 years ago," and it's sort of coming back to bite. But I don't think the government's being serious with us. They keep trying to gaslight us, trying to say everything's okay. Oh, we're delivering. We're great. We're doing all this great stuff. When in fact they're not, and it's going hell in a handbasket.
Yeah, and just a couple of illustrations of that. There was a chart that was put up, I think, in the AFR and the Economist, showing that the inflation rate in Australia is now top of the list relative to other Western countries, which is remarkable. It's above 5. And whilst the expectation was that inflation in Australia was not going to be such a big issue, it looks though it is a big issue. And interestingly, more than half of that inflation is directly connected to Albo's policies. So things like
Alboflation.
Alboflation, yeah, exactly. But things like electricity, things like the rents, things like the high migration. So what's interesting about that is that the RBA, which may have to raise rates again, the notes from the last meeting suggest that they were still seeing potential to have to lift further. It means that those interest rate rises won't necessarily tackle those elements of inflation that actually are Albo policy led.
Yeah, they're not. Well, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that you've got basically a central bank that's got one tool. It's got one blunt tool, interest rates, and then you've got a federal government which has a myriad of tools at its disposal, and we're basically relying on the central bank with one tool to try and fix a problem. Whereas we really need the federal government to step in and do what it can to fix the problem, but it's doing the opposite. So Tarek Brooker, you've got in your show a lot. He's a bit of a legend. He He coined this term, I'm pretty sure it's him, called the burnout economy, probably 6 months ago, I reckon. Like, I've used it a few times, and it's a great term he's used, where he basically says you got the Reserve Bank of Australia's hiking interest rates at record pace, blah blah blah, and it's got its foot planted firmly on the brake, trying to slow aggregate demand. At the same time as you've got the federal government with its foot planted on the accelerator, bringing in record numbers of people, which is basically growing demand. In the face of the fact that the fact of the matter is, we've got households individually are cutting back, but when you're growing the population like a science experiment by about 2.8% a year, the civilian labour force is grown by. You've got it means that basically the overall economic pie continues to grow, even though our share of the pie and our spending is actually shrinking per capita. And the Reserve Bank cares about the whole economic pie. Like, it cares about the aggregate demand in the economy. It doesn't care about per capita demand, because that's not what feeds into prices, etc. So effectively, we've got a situation where the federal government's doing everything it can to basically keep inflation higher and to basically keep interest rates higher. So, and the end result is we've got 2/3 of Australia getting smashed. You got basically, 1/3 or roughly. I mean, it's not, the percentages aren't exact, but basically 1/3 of Australians are renters, 1/3 of them got mortgage holders, and 1/3 of them are free and clear, own their own home, and aren't renting nor are mortgage holders. And the 2/3 that are renting, the renters are probably the worst off, because they tend to be the poorest, and they're getting smashed by rising rents, like by turbocharged rents and record low vacancy rate. But then you've got the mortgage holders are getting smashed, obviously, by the rises in interest rates. And then you've got 1/3 of Australia who's laughing and spending big, and we've got a chart later on to show that. They're basically milking it, and they're actually spending big at the moment. They've ramped up their spending massively. And that in itself is causing a problem, because that 1/3 of the population, who are primarily baby boomers, I don't want to generation shame, but they're spending up, adding to this aggregate demand in the economy, in addition to the mass immigration. And then that's causing the RBA to also keep rates high for long, which is punishing the third who are mortgage holders, and also arguably is going to stuff housing supply, because higher interest rates make it harder, for wrecks both demand for new homes, because people got to borrow for them, and also, makes development more expensive. So it's going to arguably smash the supply side of the housing market, which is going to push up rents as well. So it's a kind of diabolical situation. We've got to sort of, the Reserve Bank's caught in a bit of a virtuous cycle caused by, and the circuit breaker really needs to come from the federal government. The virtuous cycle is rising rents, pushes up inflation and other things, but rents, rents is a major driver, causes the RBA to hike interest rates, which then creates housing supply even more, which then leads to higher rents, and then leads to blah, 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 and so on. That's not the only issue, of course, but they're sort of caught in this virtuous cycle. And what you need is the federal government to provide a circuit breaker and to slow this net immigration down from these absurd levels that we've got currently back to, sort of historical averages, preferably. And to make sure that the immigration runs at a level that's below the nation's ability to supply homes and infrastructure. And that's the way you basically alleviate the shortage. And if you don't do that, which we're not doing, the shortage is just going to get worse, of course. It's just basic common sense. If you keep running population growth above the nation's ability to supply housing infrastructure, we're obviously going to get greater shortages in housing infrastructure and all the problems that come with that. So, the Albanese government is basically, it went to the election, or before the election last year, in January last year, before the election, it said that it was going to run a lower immigration program. It wasn't an explicit policy, but it said that in the media. There was lots of statements about it. And then it went to the election and has ramped it up to levels we've never seen before. So, they lied to us. And they really deserve to be punished.
I guess the observation is also that some of the seeds for the problem were laid in the previous set of administrations too, right? So this
has been decades in the making.
Yeah, this isn't just it's gone wrong in the last year, 18 months. The seeds were laid probably before the global financial crisis, but certainly after the global financial crisis. We had the deregulation of the financial system. We had ultra low interest rates. We had the RBA taking rates way too low for way too long. We then had, significant migration. Then we had, of course, the COVID environment, which didn't help for a period, and then very high migration. I would put a lot of the blame also on Treasury and the philosophical basis that Treasury has. And of course, whichever side of politics are in power, Treasury is guiding the game, really.
Yeah, and I used to work there. And I know I've said this in previous shows, but Treasury have become like a growth lobby rent seeker.
Yeah.
So I often explain the growth lobby is basically like the three horsemen of the immigration apocalypse. Right. So you've got big business, big property, and now, well, a relatively recent entrant is the universities or the higher education industry. Right. So those are the three, the three puppets who basically always push for this big migration. And big business obviously loves it because, they can expand their market. So, if you're a Harvey Norman, for example, I'll just pick on Harvey, Jerry, or you're Harry Triggerboff, big property, you got big retail, big property, just two examples. You can use any of these sorts of things. Growing the population by, 2% a year is the easiest way to boost their profits. You can constantly boosting demand. You're constantly growing your customer base by 2%. At the same time, you can also have greater access to migrant workers, which you can then use to try and push down wages in your sector. So for example, if you're Harvey Norman, you can employ international students, etc. And Harvey Norman's probably not the right example because those guys would be very regulated in their what they pay, but there's a whole bunch of industries which aren't, and you can effectively lower local wage growth by doing that. So it's a double bonus for them. You grow your customer base, you can potentially put downward pressure on wages. Harry Triggerboff loves it. He's always pushing for big migration because he's got more people to sell apartments to, and it keeps it basically keeps the pedal on the metal for property prices and also the rental market because he owns a lot of rental properties as well. Like his portfolio, he owns heaps of Meriton rental properties, so he makes double bank. And then you've also got the university sector or the higher education sector who basically gets to privatise all the gains from all the international students, while the costs are socialised on the rest of us in terms of tighter rental markets and less infrastructure per person and all the congestion pressures that come around that. So I call them the three horsemen of the immigration apocalypse, but Treasury is bizarrely one of them as well. Like it's the reason for that is, and I've talked about this ad nauseum here before, is we've got this vertical fiscal imbalance in the country where about 80% of the tax revenue goes to the federal government and 20% goes to the states and local government. So you've got this bizarre incentive whereby the federal government, i.e. Treasury, gets to pick up the gains from immigration through company taxes, personal income taxes, etc. They love it. They love big migration. Easiest way to grow the tax base. Problem is, they don't pay for the costs, or they pay for only a very small share of the cost. So most of the costs get shunted onto the state governments. They've got to provide most of the infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and most of the public services. So they shunt most of the costs off to the state governments, who then push them onto us by privatising everything, by doing these public-private partnerships and basically, force everything to be user pays. So the end result, and I've said this last time, if you're say a Sydney sider, 20 years ago, during the time of the Sydney Olympics, you could drive around Sydney in relative ease. I'm not saying there wasn't traffic congestion, but compared to now, it was very easy. And you could go most places without paying toll roads. There was only a couple of toll roads back then. Nowadays, it's congested everywhere, and you got Transurban with the hand in your pocket, sticking in there for toll road because wall-to-wall toll roads everywhere across Sydney. And that's because the state government is out to try and build all this, tunnels and roads, et cetera, to keep up this massive population growth Sydney's experienced. 1.2 million people, roughly. Actually, it might be a little bit more than that since the Sydney Olympics. And see, similar in Melbourne. And this is the whole thing. If there wasn't this vertical fiscal imbalance and it was a 50-50 split in both revenue and costs between the feds and the states, there's no way the federal government running this mass immigration to the same level, because suddenly it would be forced to wear the costs of immigration, not just gain the benefits. And that's kind of the seed of this whole problem when it comes to policy. The feds love it, and they keep, and obviously got these lobbyists who are whispering in their ear, demanding it. So it's a win-win from their perspective. But the costs fall on everyone else. And the thing I don't understand, and I never have understood this, is why aren't the states up in arms about this because they're the ones who are paying the price. And bizarrely, we're getting a little bit of pushback, a tiny bit, not really against immigration levels. It's more about they just want a bit more money for infrastructure. But really, they should be, if you got Chris Minns and Jacinda Allen, the two premiers of the two biggest states, together, and they said that if they got together and they said the federal government, oh, slow this down, you pay us $100,000 per migrant that settles in our state or in a state to cover the lifetime infrastructure costs, I guarantee a Treasury, if they had to pay that, they would pull back on immigration big time because suddenly they wouldn't just see benefits, they'd see costs as well. And that'd be directly on the budget. But that's kind of long and short of it. You got these, the three horsemen, the business lobbies, property lobby, university. Then you got the federal treasury, which has become almost like a lobby in itself. Always pushing for more migration because it's good for the federal budget, but ignoring the costs on everyone else. And that's not what Treasury's supposed to do. They're supposed to look at the well-being of the Australian people, but they're not. They don't look at the well-being because if they did, they wouldn't be running this absolutely psycho, ridiculous policy, which the majority of Australians don't support because we've seen the consequences the past 20 years of doing this garbage.
And I'll make one other point, Leith. I have quite a few contacts and conversations with politicians, both on the front bench, but also those on the back bench, and the independents. And they all say that it's really, really hard to do anything that actually swims against Treasury's tide. So actually, it is Treasury that is calling a lot of the shots when it comes to the way that policy is shaped, and yet they're very, very unaccountable at the same time. And whilst they occasionally go in front of parliamentary committees and things, there's not really any deep discussion about what Treasury is actually implicitly saying.
No, there isn't. And they come up with bodies now in the Treasury called the Centre for Population. Like how Orwellian is that? So they basically set up a propaganda body within the Treasury now to pump out spurious research about showing how fantastic a big Australia mass immigration policy is. And as always, like the whole model they use to measure the lifetime fiscal net benefits from immigration is all about the federal budget. It doesn't include the costs in states, the broader costs. From citizens having to pay more and user pays charges and all this other stuff to build all this infrastructure and whatever to keep up with the population growth. And I'll tell you that one of the biggest areas where this is going to come to the fore in the next decade or so is going to be water supply. It was only four years ago, and I think I said this last time. It's only 4 years ago that we're in a pretty severe drought, and Sydney's water supply was getting really low. And then of course the drought broke. We had La Nina for 3 years where it bucketed with rain and all the dams filled back up and everyone forgot about it. But we're now in Australia getting towards another El Nino period. So we're going to have another dry period, and the Bureau of Meteorology thinks it could last for a few years. And now we're going to have this period where water supplies are going to run down again. And the problem with it is we haven't really expanded the water supplies much. The dams haven't really expanded since the 1960s, and all the easy places to have dams have already been taken. So what this means is if you keep growing the population like a science experiment, and you've got obviously climate change and lower rainfall going forward, you're going to have lower natural water supply. So more demand through immigration and population growth. The intergeneration report says we're going to grow by 14 million people in the next 40 years. It's a hell of a lot of people. Mostly Sydney, Melbourne, Sydney and Melbourne. And that's going to need a whole lot more water. And the way they're going to overcome it is they're going to build a whole battery of desalination plants down the East Coast. They cost a hell of a lot of money. They use a hell of a lot of energy. We say forget about net zero. And then they're going to have to, the cost of the desal plant's one thing. You then got to build pipelines to pipe the water inland. So if you build one on, Sydney Harbour or right on the coast in Sydney, you got to somehow get that water into, say, Parramatta, like way further than Parramatta. Parramatta's only the start of the west, really. The deep west, and that can be up to 50 kilometres. So you've got to pipe that water somehow to households where we're dumping most of the migrants into that Western Sydney area against gravity uphill. which takes more power. You've got to pump it against, the weight of water is a lot. You're going to pump it uphill to those places, and that's just going to add to water costs. And modelling, I've actually got in this chart pack. I might just share my screen if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Show this. Where are we? Here we go. And I won't make the same mistake as last time where I didn't use the...
Go full screen and then you can...
Is everyone see that all right?
Yep.
Okay, so this is the end. I'm jumping around here, so...
Oh.
This chart, is it back on?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this chart here, right, so I've got two charts. First of all, this is the cost of, traditional water with dams. So this analysis was done about a decade ago. So it's just ballpark. Where a dam was costing, about 60 cents what was it? It was a kiloliter. And then you've got, this is just a Melbourne's the desal plant for Melbourne, the Wonthaggi desal. Cost $3 for the same amount. It's probably more now because, this is done about 10 years ago. But basically what it shows is, that the cost is about 5 times as much between traditional water and desalinated water. And this is what we're going to have to build. This is what we'll build, or even recycled water is expensive. And Infrastructure Australia back in 2016 did some modelling. And what they basically showed was that the real cost of water supply for households is going to go up about sixfold, or about fivefold, I guess, between 2017 and 2067. Now, this is all just indicative. It's obviously just modelling they did. It's probably not 100% right, but it gives you a ballpark estimate of how much water costs are going to go up. So households would go from spending, about $1,200 a year in 2017 dollars for their water to about $6,000 in 2017 dollars by 2067. And that's all because we're going to have to go from these natural sources to these energy-intensive, expensive sources like desal. And that's all just to keep up with population growth, which nobody really wants. I mean, let's face it. 2067, Australia's population is expected to be by 2063, it's forecast to be 40.5 million according to the Intergeneration Report. So by 2067, it's probably 42 million or something. That's a massive increase in population, and we're going to all be paying for it through increased water costs, along with all these other costs we're going to have to pay. And it's like, well, why are we doing this? Surely if there's a natural speed limit on how much population this country can absorb, water supply is probably one of the biggest ones. Why are we going against that and trying to grow it by, to levels that the country can't sustain, which means you've got to use all these technological and energy-hungry ways of doing it? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I talked about it last time. The State of the Environment report, which is basically like the International Report for the Environment, comes out every 5 years. And the latest one basically assessed population growth as having a very high impact on the environment, the natural environment. Well, of course it does. This is just one example. And, more people means more waste, means more land clearing, means more resource use, means more water use. But the Treasury doesn't care about this. They never look at this stuff. They just care about the federal budget. That's all they care about. And they should be caring about this stuff, all the negative externalities that come from this, not just looking at the benefits. And that's kind of the, symbolic of the system we've got. Sydney-siders are paying for left, right and centre for tolls. On roads they used to be able to travel around Sydney for free if they avoided the Harbour Bridge and the tunnel and that road near the airport. Now, if they want to go anywhere, they get stung. So their quality of life has been wrecked there. It's costing them more to live. Water, it's costing more. They're now living in apartments instead of houses. It's costing them a lot more for that. So it's like, well, is quality of life really going up? I don't think it is. And whenever I do this, Martin, I always go, I wish I put that chart in. And this is one that's just come to my head that I wish I put up. But basically, Urban Task Force did a fantastic, it's not fantastic for us, but it was a good chart after the 2016 census, whereby they did their projections for future dwelling composition in Sydney. And what they said was that in 2016, so time of the 2016 census, 56% of Sydney-siders lived in a detached house.
Yeah.
And the rest lived in apartments and townhouses. But by 2056 it was, only 25% of Sydney-siders will live in a detached house. 50% will live in apartments and 25% will live in townhouses. So Sydney will completely transform from a city where the majority live in detached houses to the majority living in apartments. And only 25% living in detached houses, which will most likely be more than likely wealthy people. So is that really what we want? Like, do we really want to go from a situation where, say 30 years ago, you would have had probably 70% of people living in detached houses in Sydney, to a situation where only 25% are. 25% have a backyard, and the bulk of everyone else is living in apartments built by the likes of Harry Triguboff.
And I was going to say,
I don't think that that's an advancement of living standards.
No,
personally.
And of course, the quality of the construction we've seen in the last 20 years or so, right, is very low. We've also seen a significant acceleration in the strata costs, the strata management costs, because the management costs are incurring much higher costs than they expected. And of course, the latest and greatest from, particularly in New South Wales and in Victoria, is we need more high density, right? We need more people to live in these high density, small units. It'll be cheaper. Well, it might be cheaper, but it isn't better. And going back to the question of quality of life, you can see where this is going to play out. You're going to have ghettos where effectively the property is going to become less and less attractive. And the small proportion that is, larger property, a house rather than a unit, they're going to be at such a premium. Their prices will go on rising. And in fact, if you look at the recent moves in prices, unit prices have not been rising. A lot of the momentum, certainly in Sydney, is the detached properties with large plots. That's where a lot of the momentum is. And so you can see this sort of playing out in terms of some of these differential movements in different types of property. But the future is high-rise.
Unfortunately, yes. And it didn't have to be this way, but that the powers that be, the Australian Treasury, the like of those, the likes of them, and everyone else seems to think that this is the way forward. And Australians must live in. How dare we enjoy the famed quality of life that Australians used to enjoy? We're not allowed to anymore. And if you push back on this, you're racist, xenophobic, blah blah blah, and all this sort of stuff. Come on. This is all pretty basic stuff. And, it's one of the reasons why I've been such a strong opponent of the Big Australia policy for a decade. Because I just see it as absolutely quality of life destroying. It's for all the reasons I've just said. You're living, housing affordability and quality, having your cost of living going up in all these various ways. Like, the water supply is a classic. And you combine it with all the other policy failures we've got in this country, whether it's be energy or whatever else. And you can see why living standards are going backwards, despite what they say. Like, I don't care what the numbers say, and the numbers aren't pretty anyway. But, nobody can say that the quality of life in Australia has improved over the past, 20 years. Like, if anyone who's old enough can think back to the Sydney Olympics, and you think about, I know there's a lot of nostalgia and all that sort of stuff whenever you look back, but the good old days. But if you think about the cost of living and cost of everything back, say, during the 2000s, during the Sydney Olympics, and compare it to now, it's chalk and cheese. And yet Australia went through a whole massive once-in-a-generation mining boom through that, and it's like, it didn't really make us richer. It made certain segments richer, but it hasn't made us richer as a people.
Well, that money wasn't invested appropriately, and we should have followed the Norways of this world, where they actually started creating a fund for the future for the people, as it were, rather than the way it was done in Australia. And look, I came to Australia in 1994, and to my mind, it was like from night to day in terms of the quality of life I came from the UK. I was living very close to London, so I was used to the sort of the congestion and everything else. Came to Australia, it was, wow, this is amazing. There's so much space, and there's so much freedom, and even the things like the ferries would actually connect with the buses. I mean, never happened in the UK. It was like they got the timing right. So at that stage, it was an amazing place. But over the sort of 25, 28 years that I was there, it just deteriorated. And I moved out of Sydney well over 10 years ago, because I was just fed up with the massive change there, and the sort of the traffic and everything else. But even down south, in the sort of regional areas, it's the same situation. We actually, in Thirroul, where I used to live, we used to have local traffic jams. I mean, it's a little town, but you just wouldn't go out at certain times. And I'm thinking there's something fundamentally wrong, because people are actually giving up on what I think the Australian value proposition is for people. And yet, it's just...
Sorry,
yeah, go on.
I was going to say, it was sort of the ball in the frog thing. Like, it happens slowly.
Yeah.
And it's not until you look back,
yeah,
10 years or something, you go, wow, And the same thing happened to me, I got to say. Like, when I used to work Goldman Sachs in the city. So I went to Canberra in 2003, and I left Melbourne January 2003, arrived in Canberra a day before the bushfires hit. That was fun. But anyway, then I came back to Melbourne 3 years later, and that was right at the start of the population Ponzi. So basically, I came back to Melbourne January 2006, and Melbourne had changed a bit, but it hadn't really, hockey sticked upwards. And then from that, Australia's net overseas migration rocketed. I've got a chart actually here which can show it beautifully. Let's go back to the top. Okay, so basically 2006, 2005, that's 2005 there roughly, immigration shot up. And it's been elevated ever since, apart from the little dip during the pandemic, which was more than made up. And so I go back to Melbourne here, and it wasn't too bad. And then the explosion over the next 10 years was unbelievable. And it got to the stage where even in 2008, so I started at Goldman Sachs in 2007. I worked at the Victorian Treasury for a bit, and when they went to Goldman Sachs to try and, become a financial magnate. Little did I know the GFC was about to hit and wreck that plan. But, it got to the stage where just even traveling in the train in like 2 years, it went from being, fairly packed to being absolute sardine can. So I actually started riding my bike to the city. So it was actually good in retrospect. So for 4 years, I rode my bike to the city every day. And occasionally just caught the train when it was wet. And my God, what was it unbearable then? I'd hate to think what it's like now. Like, I obviously work from home because the pandemic's probably changed things. But I would hate to think what it was like leading up to the pandemic, trying to catch a train in Melbourne. Like, luckily, I've been working from home for 10 years, doing Macrobusiness. But it got to the stage, and I've noticed it driving to. So I do boxing in a place called Macrobusiness, which is about a 15-minute drive from my place in good traffic, and can get worse if it's bad. But if you go, I stopped going at night times because the traffic just got so hideous that it ended up being a half an hour trip. Whereas a couple of years ago when I used to do that drive, it was 20 minutes. So it's just little things where basically it takes a few minutes more of your life every year to do the same stuff. And, in this case, driving to boxing, it ramped up massively after the pandemic ended. And, it's little stuff that you don't necessarily notice every year, but when you look back, you go, wow, it really has, has changed, and changed for the worse. So, and it didn't have to be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way, but unfortunately we've got a federal government that's hell-bent to, make sure this is the way, and it continues, forever, pretty much.
And I guess
cheered on by the Australian Treasury.
Yeah, I was going to say, the government, the Treasury. And it's interesting because somebody asked earlier on, well, why don't politicians actually call the Treasury out? The truth is, most politicians don't actually know enough to be able to actually ask the right questions. And they also find that they've got a huge resistance if they start probing. And I worked with a number of politicians over 15 years on housing policy behind the scenes to try and actually shift some of these dials, but they will always get hit by Treasury's view being the only view that works, and they just had no ability to be able to shape policy differently other than what Treasury and the government want. So there is a fundamental power question inside the political system, where effectively, if you don't believe in neoliberalism and growth and all those things, and bring more people in, you are somehow regarded as actually not getting the game. When in fact, as you said earlier on, it's all about the lobbying. The lobbying is creating that, because there are winners as well as losers. It's just that ordinary Australians, ordinary businesses are the losers.
That's right, yeah. And look, obviously, if you're an oligopoly, if you're one of the big business, you love this population growth. It's great for them for the same reasons. It expands your customer base, whatever. Also gives you a greater pool of workers to compete against. They can compete against each other for jobs, etc. But if you're just a Joe Blow small business, it's pretty much the same as it. It doesn't matter to them if you own a coffee shop, whatever. This huge population growth doesn't benefit you, because it's just as likely that you're going to have an increase in the number of coffee shops to keep up with population growth. So you're just going to have another competitor down the street. So it's really the big end of town that drives this stuff. Whereas the households and the small businesses and everyone really get no benefit. And in the case of households, at least, we actually just get costs. Smaller and more expensive housing and traffic congestion and having to pay for tolls now because you have to build a whole bunch of toll roads, and higher water costs and blah, blah, blah. All this sort of stuff. All the nuts and bolts stuff that we've all lived. If you're from a big city in Australia, you know what I'm talking about because you lived it. And unfortunately, they don't care. And the worst thing about it is you've got all sides of politics seem to be for it. So you've got the fake Greens on the left, who are the biggest open borders nuts in the country. Like those guys would, if they had their way, they'd have no borders. Some of the statements that come out of Nick McKinn, their immigration minister, is just lunacy stuff. During the pandemic, they were basically saying bring our temporary migrants home when they left. Our temporary migrants. I remember actually used that term. It's insane. So and they're supposed to be the guardians of the natural of the environment. They don't care about the environment, because if they did, they wouldn't be pushing for this junk policy. They're supposed to care about equality and all this sort of stuff. Well, they wouldn't be pushing for this junk quality because it hurts the poorest the most, including the new migrants or the recent migrants that arrived. It hurts them the most. Anyone who's not in the property market yet, and has to compete for housing and rentals and all the other stuff is made worse off by this. Forced to live in the middle of nowhere, Timbuktu, or in a high-rise slum. That's basically their choice, or on the street, or in share houses.
Tell you something, Leith. I might run my mortgage stress and rental stress, and the segment with the highest rental stress are those first-generation migrants.
100%.
It's amazing to see, because it used to be, lower socioeconomic groups and those things. But no, it's very clear now. It's these first-generation migrants who come into the country, I guess, with all good intention, and then just get hit over the head with a 4x2. And it's been going up and up and up. And that's just a really interesting observation. So people are coming into the country and then finding that they're just getting squashed.
Same's happening in Canada. So there's a lot of discussion in Canada. So Canada's basically having... if you thought our immigration program was nuts, Canada's up there with the most obscene I've ever seen. That's a country of 40 million people. And it's so basically where Australia is supposed to be by 2062, 63, according to the Intergenerational Report. Canada's there now. And they're, last year they welcomed nearly 1.2 million migrants last financial year. It's just an extraordinary number. And they've got the same problems. They now literally got 10 cities. In places right across the country, Vancouver, all their parks. They've got 10 cities developing, and now there's a big. Now a lot of the migrants who are there are saying we've been duped. We were came over here with good intentions, told to get the Canadian dream, all this sort of stuff, and now they're just basically either the working poor, total fringes of society struggling to get housing, whatever. Or, they're also, a lot of them have been forced to become homeless. So it's the same problem. And it's just, it's a stupid policy that that basically impacts the poorest and the most vulnerable most, as well as obviously, the natural environment and everything else. And the funniest thing is, the federal government's still pushing with this, 43% emissions reduction target by 2030, which we're nowhere near that, and we're never going to make. And they will still want to have net zero by 2050, which basically means that we're going to have no net carbon emissions by 2050, which makes absolutely no sense when you're going to grow your population the next 40 years by about 50%. So this whole, none of it adds up.
No.
14 million people, they're going to need about 5.5 million homes built if you account for demolitions. They're going to need, at least 10 million new cars.
And how many did we build last year? New homes, something like 120,000 or something?
No. So actually got a good chart on that actually here. So basically, Australia added 170,000 net additions to the housing market last financial year. So the way that's worked out is in the ABS's, housing used to do a house price series. I think they got rid of that, but they do like a housing value series every quarter. And in there, they actually have an estimate of the number of dwellings in Australia. So before I got on the show, I actually looked it up. And, in the year to June, Australia added 170,000 net homes to its housing stock. So that's basically your dwelling completions minus demolitions. That's the way they estimate it. It'll probably get revised, but that's the latest estimate. That's 170,000 against an estimated population increase of 626,000, according to the national accounts. So obviously it's not enough. And the worst thing is all the forward-looking indicators in construction are even worse. So those are all. So here we've got dwelling completions against population growth. That's the year to September, year to June. So I've basically estimated that at 500,000 because that's basically what all the data is showing. Population growth, that's based on the national accounts figures. That's 626,000 and dwelling completions was about 172. But all the quarterly indicators, so if you look at the dwelling approvals, which is the blue line here, only 164,000 dwellings were approved in the year to September. So it's getting worse. And just to put that into perspective, that's obviously before demolitions. That figure of 164,000 is 76,000 below the Albanese government's housing target. So as we know, the government's promised to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years, which requires 240,000 homes a year to be built. Now, admittedly, that target doesn't start till, July 1 next year is when it starts. But even so, the current run rate is 76,000 below that if you base it on these approvals. And that's assuming these approvals are all built. So we're not even, the situation is getting worse. It's not getting better. It's falling further behind that target. It's not, the trend is clear. It's down. This is annual. It's down. So, Louis Christopher's latest boom bust report, I think he estimated that dwelling completion is going to fall to about 150,000. I don't know if that was next year or the year after, but basically construction's cratering. It's still falling. And you can see why. We've got obviously, super high interest rates. You've got materials costs through the roof. You've got shortages of labour. Builders have gone bust left, right and centre. So the supply picture is way worse than it was last decade when we were building, when the biggest year ever was 223,000 homes here. Yet the government somehow thinks we're going to get to 240, which is about here. Again, we're going to keep it there for 5 years continuous, straight, under their target. It's delusional stuff here. It's not going to be met. The equation's going the wrong way. We've got all these forces which says that we're not going to match the shoddy high-rise construction boom we had last decade, which obviously built all the flammable cladding apartments with cracks in them and all that sort of stuff. And the other thing is, even if they could magically build this 240,000 homes a year, what sort of quality are they going to be?
No.
Like when we ramped up construction last decade, we all saw what we got. Got the high-rise boom with crappy built apartments, flammable cladding, cracks, balcony leaks, structural flaws in balconies, leaking apartments, all this sort of stuff, which, basically buying a recently built high-rise apartment in Australia has become a game of Russian roulette. You don't know what you're going to get. And there's a whole bunch of people who've lost their wealth or been, stung with massive repair bills of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, if the government wants to build them this quickly, we're going to repeat the same again, aren't we? Because you're going to have to create equality to build the number of homes quickly. Because when you try and build them that quick, you're obviously going to compromise on quality. You have to. So, the solution to all this is quite simple. Just slow the bloody population down. Like, don't import so many people, and you can take your time with everything and do it to a better standard. Like, it's pretty obvious. If you rush things go wrong. And yet the government's whole plan is to basically fire hose people in here and then try and build, fire hose them in here and then try and patch it up later by just, building all these crappy apartments everywhere. It's so stupid.
Yeah, it is. And you mentioned Louis Christopher, and of course he's published his Boom and Bust, and here's the killer chart, right, which shows the four scenarios. It's interesting that he's now recognised that population growth is a critical determinant of what happens to home prices from this point forward, right? And in a way, one of the reasons why home prices have not drifted lower, as you would expect with high interest rates, is because of the high migration. Yeah,
that's it. Well, I mean, look, to his credit, it's been pretty good calling for low immigration for a long time now. For probably better part of the last year. And look, he wasn't the only one that was wrong with this. I was wrong in the direction of the housing market as well. I thought with the massive increase in interest rates we got, you'd get a bigger housing correction than we did. And it just turned out that, that just the sheer weight of numbers and the housing shortage, both in rents and, the FOMO it's created, has overwhelmed this huge rise in mortgage payments, which is quite incredible because mortgage costs have gone up over 50%. Since the RBA started hiking. And yet we've had this big house price rebound where house prices are now at a record high, which is quite extraordinary. And it just shows you that this unbelievable population boom has done the job over the 4.25% rise in interest rates. So it's extraordinary circumstance. And pretty much, I've got to give the guy credit. I've given him credit a bunch of times, but pretty much the only economist who was calling a house price rebound was Stephen Koukoulas, the kook. And I must admit, when he said it, when he had his debate with Chris Joy, I thought, Chris Joy's wiped the floor then, because I thought, mate, how can house prices only fall 10% when you've got this absolutely ginormous rise in interest rates? But he was right; they only fell 10%, and then they've recovered that. And I sure as hell, because borrowing capacity has fallen by about 30%. And based on that alone, you think that if borrowing capacity falls by 30%, you're going to get a pretty hefty fall in house prices. Won't necessarily be 30%, but sure as hell, if it was normal population growth, probably closer to 20 with such a massive increase in interest rates. But instead, no, they fell and now they've rebounded. And it's all based on this, unbelievably huge population growth that we've never seen before, whereby the civilian population is effectively growing at twice the rate of twice the rate of the pre-COVID period. We're adding, 600 plus thousand people a year, whereas even in the pre-COVID mass immigration times, we're adding 300. Just over 300 in net overseas migration, but the 15 plus civilian population was about 300,000, according to ABS unemployment statistics, labour market statistics. So, we're sort of running at double that rate, and it's just driving rents through the roof, and it's pushing up house prices against the massive headwind of these huge interest rate hikes. So it's quite an extraordinary situation we've got here, and all brought to you by your friendly, smiling, lispy Albanese government.
And one other question, of course, is if you think about where things are now, you've got rates higher for longer. You've got potentially more people in difficulty. And I was looking at some of the pain and gain data from New Zealand, which is quite interesting because they've had a sort of a somewhat similar story. Prices went down, they went up, they're coming back down a little now. But one interesting observation was that they've now got something like more than 10% of properties sold in Auckland recently were actually sold at a loss. And so what you've got is those people who bought more recently when, of course, rates were ultra low and when the mortgage capacity was very high are the ones that are being forced to sell. And I suppose now the question is, are we going to see something similar in Australia? And is that going to change the story with regard to prices? Or will the high migration effectively negate that? Because New Zealand had high migration too, didn't it?
Yeah, they did. Although New Zealand's migration has been slower to pick up. So they had higher migration. They lost, same as us, pretty similar to us, except they opened their borders later, and they've now got record high migration now, but it's took longer to get there, I guess. It's just sort of a more recent phenomenon. The big difference between Australia and New Zealand, though, is, and I've got a chart here of from Justin Farbo from Macrobusiness Group. He did a great chart on comparing the house price booms. So basically, New Zealand had the biggest run-up in house prices, to the late 2021 peak. Like an absolutely huge house price boom. Australia's, by contrast, was big, but it wasn't anywhere near as big as New Zealand's. And it is New Zealand's peak to trough losses were a lot higher than Australia. So I think nationally they fell by about 17% peak to trough, and then in Auckland they fell by about 22% by memory, according to the leading index, which is Real Estate Institute in New Zealand. So whereas Australia's house prices are obviously pretty much back to the peak now, and there's a few variances across jurisdictions, etc. But I think that's one of the reasons why the pain has been a lot more for New Zealand buyers, because they had a much bigger house price correction. So if you were someone who bought, around here, and then you're seeing prices tank, or anywhere around here and prices are tanked, you're going to be underwater. And whereas Australia, we had a smaller dip and prices have already rebounded anyway. So I think there's less likely to be pain in Australia than New Zealand, just because we didn't get nearly as big a house price correction. And an interesting thing about this data is New Zealand's house price looked like they were rebounding for similar reasons to us. Migration's rebooting and all that. They're in a per capita, their economy's stuffed as well. But interestingly, it actually looks like it's rolling over. And so same with Canada. And whereas Australia's, and UK's for that matter as well, whereas Australia's are still going up, although the latest CoreLogic daily index data, this is from Justin Farbo, reported this today, shows that house prices are rolling over. So Sydney, and at the 5 city level, we're also starting to roll a bit. So what I mean by rolling over is it's still growing, but the pace of growth is slowing quite obviously. And whereas the smaller capitals are still doing fine. So it does look like the latest rate hike has probably taken some sting out of the market. We've seen that with auction clearances as well. They've softened recently, which I should have put that chart in. It's another one I just remembered. Which suggests that the housing market's starting to, it's at least losing momentum. And it has been for the last month or so. But I think this latest rate hike, you can see it here in this data, it definitely has turned down. The rate of growth's sort of dipped in the last few weeks. And we'll see what happens. Like if the RBA does hike again, in February, I don't think I'll do it next month, but because there probably won't be enough data to justify another hike next month. But there's a decent chance it could do it in February. It'd be interesting to see if that's sort of the straw that breaks the camel back of the market and brings another downturn. And Louis Christopher thinks that's going to happen, at least in, his forecast was for 5 capitals: Sydney, Melbourne, I think Hobart, Canberra, and missing one. We're going to, I can't, Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Canberra,
Adelaide.
I can't remember. Adelaide. Oh no, Adelaide was going to be flat, I think. Yeah, but anyway, five of the capitals were going to fall in value, and I think Perth and Brisbane are going to rise according to his forecast. Yeah, sorry, you got it there. Yeah, so I've actually got that over here, and I've got my charts here, so I didn't see it. It's not my shot, but yeah, there you go. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens next year. And also, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens politically. I mean, the Albanese government's obviously under the pump, and is it going to, is next year when it really comes a cropper? Like, are we going to get a big lift in unemployment next year? There's some charts here which you might want to put up. So, but basically, as we know, Australia's population is growing at an absolutely unbelievable rate. So this is out of the ABS labour force statistics. So as I said before, it's grown about 600,000 a year, which is sort of about double the level that it was just before the pandemic. And then, this whole thing about, we've got to catch up migration, we've already caught up. So Australia's population has already caught up to what the trend would have been if we hadn't had the pandemic, and we still ran at population growth from the pre-pandemic era. And what this means is that we've got this massive supply of labour coming in at the same time as demand is falling. So almost my gold standard labour market chart now that I like to use is the SEEK, this chart from SEEK. So what it shows is SEEK's job ads. So it shows the demand for workers is falling, which is shown in the red line. And also this is the much more important figure, this blue one. It's the number of applications per job ads. That's sort of a combination of the red one as well as labour supply. And what it shows is that Australia's applications, the number of applications per job ad nationally is now well above where it was pre-pandemic. So we've actually got, a whole, way more people now competing for jobs than even we had before the pandemic. And that's a function of obviously slowing labour demand as well as, massive rises in labour supply as shown here. And traditionally these two measures, this applications per job ad has been a decent leading indicator for the unemployment rate. So this is from Shane Oliver, and for some reason I've cut the date axis off here, but so you got to trust me on that. It's the same as this one. And what it shows is that we've had this obviously massive spike in applications per jobs, but the actual official unemployment rate has barely picked up yet. And really, logically, you have to think it's a matter of time. You've got the RBA hiking rates, and you've got obviously this big, which is going to slow demand in the economy. We're already in a per capita recession, etc., and households are cutting back individually. At the same time, you've got this record labour supply. So, next year we could conceivably have a situation where the unemployment rate shoots up a lot. We've still got rising mortgage rates, so you've got more households under pressure, and then you've obviously got this ongoing rental inflation because housing supply is running at such a terrible level versus demand. So that's sort of like, you think that's going to be a tinderbox for the Albanese government. It's going to be a triple whammy. And, when's the penny going to drop when suddenly everyone abandons them? We sort of saw that in the Rudd-Gillard government at times where Kevin Rudd was really popular for about 18 months. He had record popularity, and then he said, "Big Australia." Also, he got dudded on the mining tax, which was a real shame. And, voters basically dropped him like a hot potato. And then he ended up getting booted out as leader, and they brought Julie Gillard in, who just scraped by the next election, and then they obviously got rolled the election after. Well, it looks to me like Albo's sort of going down the same road. Like, he was super popular at the start, and now everyone's turning on him. And you see it in the polls. And, next year, if unemployment kicks up, you got, more people becoming homeless. You got a rental crisis that's getting worse. You got mortgage holders feeling the pain. It's not going to take too much, I think, to basically, blow the lid off this thing. And, it's going to be fun times. So I think next year is going to be a really interesting year to watch.
Yeah. And, there's quite a few comments in the chat about, social unrest, more and more people effectively feeling the pressure, and all of the data that we're seeing is through more households that are actually under pressure. My stress measurements, CBA published data quite recently that showed that too, which suggests that there's a lot of people now very much under the gun. And I guess the question
I've got some charts here just quickly, if you don't mind. I'll just switch this and encapsulate that point.
Yeah,
go. This chart's from CBA, and it basically shows you that, and this is based on RBA data and et cetera. It basically shows that Australian households in aggregate were paying the highest share on record of their incomes on debt repayments. So the reason why it's only 10% is because, remember, only one third of households have got mortgages. So it's basically the aggregate mortgage debt against aggregate household disposable income. So that's why it says only 10%. But it's more the it was at the highest level on record in May, and obviously the RBA has just raised rates again this month, so that will go higher. And at the same time, we've still got these fixed rate mortgages expiring. The cheap pandemic fixed rates. There's still a few of them expiring, so that's going to keep rising. So that means more pressure there. This middle chart, Tarek Brooker posted today. The Bank for International, I had a similar one from the BIS, but this one looks cleaner. It basically shows that Australia's debt servicing ratio, which is basically, how much we spend, what percentage of income we spend on debt repayments, is so far above other nations. It's not funny. And the interesting point is Canada now, despite the fact that Canada's lifted rates by a similar amount to us, is really only just above where we were when our interest rates were 0.1%, which is quite extraordinary. And that's a function of two things. Australia has the second highest debt load in the world, household debt load. And we've also obviously got one of the highest shares of variable mortgage rates and also these really short-term fixed rates. So what it means is that when the RBA hikes rates, it translates to mortgage holders really quickly, whereas most other countries have much higher share of fixed rates. And the classic example is the United States. Like United States is, US is, the Fed's hiked rates by similar to us, I think a little bit more, and yet their mortgage burden is barely, their debt burden is barely increased because almost everyone's on 30-year fixed rates, whereas Australia's at the other end of this, the other end of the equation, where we're mostly variable rates, and therefore our increase in mortgage rates has been translated very quickly into debt costs. And so we are probably the worst place in the world to have a mortgage, and we are the worst place in the world to have a mortgage, and we're also the worst place in the world to be when the central bank's in a tightening cycle. And this other chart, this was released today by the CBA, and it actually tracks spending across age cohorts. And to nobody's surprise, the oldest Australians are spending the most. And the reason for that is quite simply they tend to be the ones who own the homes outright and aren't renting. I'm not saying they all like that, but that's the majority of older Australians. So interest rate hikes actually have made a lot of them wealthier. So the baby boomer generation owns a very big chunk of the rental properties, and a lot of them would be owned free and clear. And obviously, this surge in rents has given them more disposable income. They've obviously got more interest income, etc. They're not feeling the squeeze on the other end from debt repayments, so they're all spending more money. At the other end of the spectrum, younger Australians who tend to be mostly in the rental market, or they have the biggest mortgages, are cutting their spending massively. So you've got this kind of three faces of Australia. You've got the 1/3 of renters getting absolutely smashed. You got 1/3 of mortgage holders who are, depends how big your mortgage are, but they're obviously getting hurt by the rate rises. And then you got 1/3 of Australians who don't rent and don't have a mortgage who are laughing and are spending big, and they're actually helping to contribute to Australia's inflation because they're spending like drunken sailors, and that's obviously increasing demand in the economy, which is forcing the RBA to hike rates, which then hurts the mortgage holders. So it's just, again, it gets down to this blunt tool. We've got this one tool, interest rates, which the RBA is, using as a hammer, and that's smashing effectively 1/3 of the economy, those who got mortgage holders directly, in order to get inflation down, which is just stupid. When really we need the federal government to do its job and share the load more equally across the population. And the best way to do it, well, the easiest way would be to slow immigration, like cut it, cut it quickly and stop adding to this demand side pressure across the economy. Stop inflating rents. Stop growing the population at a faster rate than you grow, business investment, infrastructure, housing, because at the moment, their policy is actually wrecking productivity as well, because again, there's capital shallowing across the economy. And this has been a problem for the Australian economy for pretty much this century so far, whereby the federal government has gone for labour supply growth through immigration rather than business investment growth, and that's led to basically lower productivity across the economy, because we've got this capital shallowing, whereby the nation's capital stock has been spread over fewer people. Over more people. So we've got less capital per worker, and that's one of the reasons why. And also got all these congestion problems, obviously with traffic and everything else, which also kills productivity. And it's one of the reasons why we've had this crap productivity growth this century, because we've gone for this population Ponzi economy over a smart economy that actually grows business, that grows the capital stock in relation to the population. and does capital
one observation
deepening.
there, Leith, is the RBA has only very lightly been talking about productivity, right? And the RBA hasn't really been pushing very hard on migration and those sorts of things. So it seems to me that part of this is that the RBA is sort of, messing around with the interest rates, but it's not pushing back sufficiently hard on the government in terms of those other policy settings.
They never do. Like they always talk around the issue. Like they always give you a few little nuggets. So I read the latest statement of monetary policy, and they do mention that, and Michelle Bullock today gave a presentation. I can't remember who it was to, but a speech, and she basically did mention, and they've said it a few times that basically Phil Lowe before back in May, I think it was, he said to Senate estimates, I believe it was, he said that we've got the population growing at 2%. Well, it's actually more than that, but. He said 2% at the time. And he said, are we building 2% more houses? Are we building 2% more infrastructure? Do we have 2% more business investment? No, we don't. And if you don't have that, you're going to hurt productivity, is effectively what he said. And that's capital shallowing. And the hilarious thing is, I've got a chart here, Martin, of labour productivity growth. And, we obviously had the stimulus and everything over the pandemic, but you actually, what happened was when the pandemic hit, about 500,000 temporary migrants went home. And Australia's population didn't fall; it just stayed flat. But we had a, pretty strongly negative net overseas migration for a bit, and that effectively gave us de facto capital deepening because you suddenly had less workers in the economy sharing, the same amount of capital, or if not more capital, because it was growing still. And then we had this productivity spike, and then obviously all the migrants have flooded in record numbers, and then productivity's tanked again. So now productivity's back to where it was, pretty much almost back nearly a decade ago. And so we had this capital deepening, capital shallowing. And as long as we keep going with this stupid policy where we're growing the population at this fastest rate on record, like a science experiment, and we don't build the business investment, we're not growing business investment, we're not growing the infrastructure stock, we're not growing the housing stock to the same rate, we're going to have ongoing capital shallowing, and we're going to continue to kill productivity. It's just basic economics. But they don't seem to care. Like the RBA talks around it. They have mentioned it a few times, but it's always in the margins. They don't just come out straight out. Like I'd love to see, and I was hoping with the new governor we might get some more frank and fearless advice, but I don't know. They never want to veer into because they think it's political. But they should just be saying, cut immigration. Like simple as that. Cut immigration because of this, this, and this.
Yeah.
And if they did that, well, the federal government would know where to hide, but they never do. So instead they talk about, we need to grow the supply side of the economy and blah, 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 and all this mealy-mouthed stuff, when the solution's, pretty clear. Just, if you want capital deepening, yeah, you can try and boost business investment, all that. That's one way to do it. But the other way to do it is simply don't grow the population at a greater rate than housing, infrastructure, and business investment.
Yep.
It's pretty basic stuff. Don't do that, and you'll get some capital deepening, you'll get high productivity growth. And there's other reasons too. I mean, obviously, if you make it incredibly easy for businesses to go and employ a migrant and often steal their wages and pay them less, well, then there's less incentive for them to invest in, automation and, capital equipment to try and so they're going to replace, a cheapo worker over spending, 50 grand on a new machine or something, even though spending 50 grand on a new machine would actually boost productivity. But they're always going to take the path of least resistance. And if you keep getting them, keep the migrant tap open, well, they're going to keep going for that over investing in automation, investing in, capital equipment, et cetera, which actually does boost productivity. There's a reason why in a developed country like Australia or any other developed country, when you go to past roadworks, even though they've got too many people holding up stop signs and whatever, that's stupid. But, you have a handful of people building a road with heavy machinery. You go to a very poor developing nation, you'll have 100 people with picks and shovels. It's because labour's so cheap over there. Everyone's lowly paid. But which way is more productive? Obviously, the developed country way is more productive. You use heavy machinery and whatever, you get a lot more done with less people. And it's way more productive than having hundreds of people with picks and shovels doing it the old-fashioned way. It's a reason why modern agriculture is more efficient than old-fashioned agriculture. Like having a guy, pushing a mule with a little hoe and going down like this, is a lot less efficient than having a big-ass tractor. Because that is like capital shallowing versus capital deepening. But we, as an economy, are sort of choosing the dumb growth model, where we just bring in mountains of people and we don't have the infrastructure, business investment, housing to match. And that's just killing productivity. And we've lived it because Australia's productivity growth this century has sucked while we've ramped up immigration. It's just absolutely sucked. And that's all the empirical evidence you need. We've all lived it. Like, you try and drive anywhere now, it takes you forever. Well, that's productivity growth. It's just insane. But the dunderheads in Treasury seem to they use these spurious things like, oh, migrants are more qualified than they have higher educational attainment. They're more skilled than local workers. All this stuff, which is all crap because they're paid less on average, and that's all you need to know. So, yeah, it's a joke.
And just one other observation there, and that is that, of course, with all of the pressure on bringing those people in who are prepared to work for less, means they're not paid as much, and we're seeing that in some of the numbers. The other factor, of course, you've got the AI revolution now just over the hill, right, which potentially has the ability to increase productivity but also at the expense of jobs. So there's another sort of wave coming, which I'm not sure that we've actually also necessarily thought about too. But the settings are just so off the scaly wrong. It just amazes me that they keep them there, like it's like, carry on regardless. And that's why we have the house price nightmare that we've got, the expenses nightmare, they've got the inflation nightmare. It's pretty much anchored specifically on the migration problem, right? And that's it's so simple.
And not just that, like, it is the worst policy to do when you're a resources giant and exporter like us, because we've got two options. You could follow Norway, or we could do what we do. We do everything wrong. So not only do we not tax all our mineral wealth properly like they do in Norway, but we also import obscene numbers of people to dilute our mineral wealth per capita. So, Australia's got a fixed mineral endowment, and we'd be richer if we had a population of 20 million than at 26 million. We're richer at 26 million than we are at 40 million, or 40 and a half, which is what's projected on the International Report in 40 years. Because you're basically diluting your mineral base amongst more people, which basically means you're worth less per people. Now, this might sound selfish or whatever, but, Norway doesn't do this. Norway has massive oil and gas wealth, and they're a population the size of Melbourne, just over 5 million people, about 5.5 million people. Now, since 1960, Norway's population has grown by about 25%. Ours has grown by 160%. It's like, well, can you imagine if they'd grown the population the same level as we were? They wouldn't be as rich. And they're sitting on because they tax their resources properly, and they don't dilute it amongst way more people. They've got a sovereign wealth fund that's worth, I think, $300,000 per citizen in Norway. It's huge, and they're an uber rich country. Uber rich citizens, because they've kept their mineral wealth in their own hands, effectively. It's mostly public owned. They've got government owned, oil companies and gas companies. And then if you do come in there and you want to operate as an overseas player, they take a big equity stake and they tax the hell out of you.
Yeah.
We don't do any of that stuff. And then to make it even worse, we then import tons of people to then dilute any, corporate tax we get, etc., by even more. So it's like, we are the model of how not to behave if you're a, huge mineral exporter. And Norway is the model of how you should act. And I personally would love to just sack all the federal government and bring in a whole bunch of guys from Norway and say, okay, design the system for us. Absolutely. So I guarantee you they could not stuff it up the way Australia stuffed it up.
It's like almost everything that you could possibly do wrong has been gone wrong in Australia. And yet there are models, as you say, Norway being the obvious one, but others too, of better ways. Now, as we come towards the end of the show, Jerry earlier on, thanks for the super chat, Jerry, asked, is it possible to explain how the gas market works, and also state governments, if they gave income tax The state governments gave income tax to the federal in World War II, and that potentially could have an impact on standards of living. But let's just touch on the gas market question just briefly, right? Because, of course, gas in Australia is priced at the marginal global price because of the structure of the way that the gas market works in Australia.
Yes and no. So we've actually got two gas markets in Australia. So we've got the one that does it, not as good as Norway, but does it right. So we've got the West Coast. And the reason why they're separate is because we don't have a pipeline linking east and west. So, the Whitlam government wanted to build a gas pipeline east and west, and it's a shame they didn't do it because it got shut down. But basically, so we've got WA has a ton of gas, and East Coast Australia has a ton of gas, and they both export. And together, we are the Saudi Arabia of gas. Australia exports more gas than anywhere else in the world. We are the Saudi Arabia. The difference is, on the West Coast, the Carpenter government, I think 2004, their state government, when they were setting up these gas terminals to export liquefied natural gas, they were clever. And they said, we've got a reserve fuel of our gas for domestic use, and the rest of it you can export, but we need 15%. And anyway, the industry was not happy about that. So, this is going to kill resource projects and blah, 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 and all the usual vested interest crap. And the Carpenter government said, no, bugger off, this is what we're doing. Fast forward to today, Western Australians pay about $6 a gigajoule from gas, which is low. It hasn't really didn't budge after Russia invaded Ukraine. They got cheap gas, they got cheap electricity prices because gas sets the marginal cost of electricity. And, so they do it right over there. And you still got the industry whinging. Like they're still lobbying to get rid of the gas reservation mechanism. Of course they are. They always want more. On the East Coast, this was more under the so you had the Queensland government was happy to build these export terminals in Gladstone. The Rudd-Gillard government, well, it was Gillard government at the time, stupidly argued against gas reservation. They didn't believe in it. They said it's economically inefficient, blah, blah, blah. So we built these 6 export trains. So export trains basically where you convert it from, gas to liquid before you put on a ship and send it offshore. We set up these 6 export terminals, started exporting, mid last decade. And then almost straight away, Australia's East Coast gas price was linked to the global market. And then Russia invaded Ukraine and we saw the price. So before Russia invaded Ukraine, we're paying about $8 a gigajoule. So more than WA, but, it wasn't too bad. Well up on historical averages of $2.50 to $3 a gigajoule, mind you. And then the price rocketed because the global price of gas went up and we were just basically copied the global market. And so we got to this absurd situation where despite being the Saudi Arabia of gas, the East Coast was paying the world price. So can you imagine a Saudi Arabian going filling up the car paying $2 a litre? That's basically what we're doing. Stupid. And it all comes down to failed government policy because they didn't reserve any bloody gas. They didn't copy WA. So anyway, that's basically where we're at. And, the Albanese government's done some $12, price cap, which is 50% above what it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. Still too high. But even then, there's all these carve-outs. So it doesn't actually, guarantee that you're going to get $12 gas. It just puts some limits on it. And the problem with it is that's then fed into the electricity price because gas is the marginal price setter of electricity. So the way it works is you got basically the electricity companies use renewables first, and then they buy the coal-fired, electricity second. And then the last thing they use to fill to fill any demand is the gas. And gas is actually the perfect, they call it firming fuel. So when the wind isn't blowing enough and you don't have enough sun and the renewables don't produce enough power, you've got to have a backup. And coal's pretty crap as a backup in that you can't just turn on a coal plant, instantly. You got to get it going over days to get the boilers going, all that sort of stuff. So gas is the perfect firming fuel, firming electricity. And the way the energy market was supposed to work before we did all this export crap was we were supposed to have the whole transition was meant to be you build up your renewables and you have gas as the firming fuel. When you don't have enough renewables, you fire up a gas turbine, you create your electricity that way. If gas was cheap, your overall electricity bill would be cheap because you'd have cheap renewables and you'd have cheap gas. Instead, we've created ridiculously expensive gas which has pushed up the whole cost of electricity, which is one of the reasons why there's rampant electricity inflation in the last few years, along with gas. And then it's gotten so absurd that we've engineered a freaking shortage of gas on the East Coast, so that the solution now has been to build an import terminal for gas, which is just the most moronic thing. Can you imagine the Saudi Arabians building an import terminal for for oil, because we're selling 80% of our East Coast gas overseas, mostly to China, and we've created this shortage. So the harebrained solution is, we'll build an import terminal, rather than just not bloody selling it. It's just insane. So we've got this dumb policy here, dumb politicians, dumb policy, which has basically caused another reason behind this massive inflation we've got, because they've had gas prices go through the roof, electricity prices go through. They're up about 30% since Russia invaded, Ukraine. And that's just driving up costs right across the economy, because energy is an essential input, and also means that we're deindustrializing. So while we're selling 70% of our gas to China and giving them cheap gas, cheaper than what we pay most of the time, they're industrializing, they're building up their military, all that sort of stuff. And we've shot ourselves in the foot by giving ourselves expensive energy. So we're deindustrializing, and we're all copping in the neck. It's worst if you live down here in Melbourne, Martin, because we have bloody cold winters and our houses are set up for natural gas as a heating source. And the cost of heating your home now in Melbourne is unbelievable. So, and this is all caused by stupid government policy, where we could have helped the energy transition. And it's gotten so bad, just one last point before I finish up. It's gotten so bad that because of this gas shortage now, we're now extending the life of coal-fired power plants. And then we're subsidising. So the ridiculous thing is, I think it's Erin Coal Station in New South Wales was shut down. It was meant to shut down. And then now, because of this artificial engineered gas shortage, they're now extending the life of it. And the New South Wales government is now paying billions in subsidies to the owner, which is Origin, who's one of the gas cartellers who's selling all the bloody gas overseas. So Origin's creaming it. They're gouging us of gas on the East Coast. They're flogging it overseas. They're charging us extortionate gas prices. And then they're getting subsidies to keep their coal-fired power stations going, billions, to cover the shortfall that they've helped create in the gas market. It's just absurd. It is the biggest crony capitalism situation I've ever seen. And this is, again, another dumb Australian policy from dumb politicians doing dumb things. And it's another one where Labor, this was started under freaking Labor, when the Gillard government, Gary Gray was the resources minister at the time, in 2012, basically said, no, we can't have reservation. That's economically inefficient. And it was supported by, Tony Wood from the Grattan Institute, who argued vehemently against it. Look where we are now. Always beware these neoliberal idiots, because they don't have your interests in mind, they have theirs. And that's basically the long and short of the whole stupid gas situation / electricity situation, where the Saudi Arabia of gas, and we've engineered a shortage and we've engineered high prices. Just whenever you think of that, just think about, just put yourselves, could you imagine a Saudi Arabian filling up their car for $2 a litre in petrol, and then conceivably building an import terminal to import oil to cover a shortage because they're selling it all overseas and not giving their residents a fair shake? That's what we're doing. And WA's not doing it because they were smart enough to set up a domestic reservation in mid-2000s. But no, not here on the East Coast. Crazy.
Well, I'll tell you something, Leith. I expected when I came over to the UK to be paying a lot more for my annual energy bills than I did in Australia. Right? I'm not. So despite the massive rises of gas and electricity prices, I actually I'm paying less than I was in Australia, which is astonishing. I mean, it's just, it shows you that the marginal price for energy in Australia is way wacky off the scale, simply because of the cartel, simply because of the bad policy that was implemented by not just Albanese but the previous governments too.
Oh, all of them.
But the net effect, and going back to what we said at the start of the show, inflation is being driven by bad policies in Australia, right? Energy policies, housing policies, immigration policies, That's the reason why inflation is going to be stubborn and sticky and difficult to get under control. And yet, the government is not prepared to take the decisions they should be taking to deal with some of those structural issues.
That's right. And it's going to cost them at the ballot box. But the problem is, what's going to happen? If we get rid of this mob, we get in Dutton and his cronies. And I mean, they might be slightly better on some things, but they're going to be worse than others, no doubt. Really it's just, the king is dead. Long live the king. Another one comes in. The same,
Treasury is there, you see. It's irrespective of who's in charge. Treasury is calling the shots. And that's it, mate. That's the problem, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the political class who basically are neoliberal aligned and aligned with the big end of town, et cetera, and are driven by those big numbers, the top line numbers in terms of tax take and population growth and those sorts of things. It is a mess. And what I don't understand is why, on this channel and a few others, we're calling it out, you're calling it out on Macrobusiness and elsewhere, but in the mainstream, there's almost no discussion of these big policy mistakes.
No, there isn't. I mean, you get slivers. So, the ABC will come out with the odd article that's great. Like Ian Brenda wrote a good one today on, rents and population growth and that sort of stuff and immigration. But it's just few and far between, you know what I mean? You get one of those for every 10 who are just, Ponzi articles, paid shill articles. And unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And then you have the other side, you have the mobs like The Guardian, who basically, whinge about everything, but never will ever mention immigration because it goes against their credo. They can't do it because that's racist. So it's just a shell game. Unfortunately, I mean, look, I shouldn't complain about too much because it's sort of created a career for me. Macrobusiness wouldn't exist if everything was working and the mainstream media wasn't busted. We wouldn't have started the bloody thing in the first place.
Yeah.
So I guess from a selfish point of view, maybe it's worked out well, but geez, it's frustrating.
No, and I had Cameron on the other week, Game of Mates Cameron. And of course, his big thesis is you got to understand the power play behind all of these decisions, right? And the fact that those big entities have huge political influence and huge economic influence on the politicians. And so, the question is, well, who's calling the shots then? Who is actually really in charge at the end of the day?
Yeah, and look, Cameron's one of the good guys. Like Cam Murray's a good mate of mine, and we talk on the phone every week and whatever. And he's just one of the few honest economists out there. And there's a few of us. Tarek Brooker, us at Macrobusiness, Cam, there's a couple of us still willing to call it out as it is, and often to our own detriment, I must say, but. We're few and far between, and it's because like the whole economic fraternity is basically it's full of shills. I mean, if you think about it, if you want to work as an economist, you got to, unless you want to go out on your own, you got to work for like an industry group. You got to work at the Treasury. You got to work at somewhere where you're basically you're going to be compromised one way or another.
Yep.
And that's just the way it is, unfortunately. And because of that, a lot of it's cash for comment. And another bad thing, not just the Treasury is bad, but it's just the broader public service. Even when I was there in 2003 to 2006, it was a lot better run than what it is now. Like I can't remember us using really consultants at the time, but now it's just like everything is cash for comment. You go and if you want a result, instead of despite the fact that the public service is bloated and the people working has grown more and more. We spend billions of dollars on these external consultancies every year instead of doing it in-house. And they do that because they can slap a massive report down the table and go, look, bang, here's this independent report from PwC, whatever, or Deloitte or whatever, saying that we should do this. And then really all they've done is they've briefed PwC, Deloitte, and said, okay, we want some modelling that gives us this outcome so that we can then sell it. And then that's basically how it works. It's cash for comment. And that's basically everything's political, every conceived. and that's why we get these poor outcomes, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's the system, isn't it? So we need to be calling out the system and then trying to get some change. But calling out the system is step one, because you need to actually raise awareness, which is what you guys have been doing and what we do here and elsewhere. Well, Leith, we've come to the end of our time. If people want to find out more about what you're up to, I know you've been very active on social media and on the mainstream media too. So you've got a YouTube channel and you've got Macrobusiness. So where are the best places for people to go?
Yeah, look, number one, definitely, the mothership is macrobusiness.com.au. That's where basically, write every day. And that's mine and Dave's baby, Dave Llewellyn-Smith. So we run that, have for 11 years now, I think it is. I'm getting come up to 12. It's amazing how quickly it goes. I've also got a YouTube channel. Now, look, it's nothing like this one. All it is, I don't do great live shows and that sort of stuff that Martin does. There's no real production value. All I do is I just basically upload my media interviews. So I've been doing heaps on Sky News, and I do, weekly one on Radio 2GB, and I've seemed to be a bit of a media guy now. I get asked a lot. So all I wanted was an place where I can put all my media interviews. So I've got somewhere to point to, and when I get older, I can look back and go, geez, I was good looking back then, stuff like that. But anyway, that's Leith Vo, Leithvo is my YouTube tag. So if you want to subscribe, just don't expect this kind of content. It's just really just a amalgamation of my media interviews. That's all it is. So you can, if you go, what's Leith been doing in the media? Just go there. You see all my videos. That's all it is. Well, I want to say thanks, Leith. I always enjoy speaking with you, and I'm sure we'll do it again early in the new year. There's so much to explore, but these important trends that we've been touching on tonight, we want to make sure that those are shared. So folks, please like and share the show here and get some of these messages out. And thank you very much for your time, Leith. I'm going to take you offline now, and I'll close the show. But look forward to the next one, which there'll be more to talk about, because this thing is just rolling like you wouldn't believe. Next year is going to be even more interesting than this year, Martin, I'm sure. It's dead right, Leith, indeed. Thank you very much. Take care. Cheers. And I'm going to close the show now. So this is Martin North saying thank you very much for watching and commenting and all those, and the super chats and everything else. Just to say that next week I've got Adam Stokes on. We're going to talk about crypto and what's going on in crypto land. Of course, the value of crypto has gone up recently. What's going on? Is it real? Is it illusory? And all those things. So join us for that. And one last look at the dogs. They've hardly moved at all for the whole time we've been on. So that's I'll take them out for a walk now. That's the next part of my day. So I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Thanks for the super chats. Thanks for all the comments. Follow us during the week on our recorded shows, and we'll be back next week for the next live show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.